Okay, well, thank you, Jessica, for your kind welcome. Thank you to Fay Libertad and also the Henry Hazlitt Centre for your very kind welcome. This topic that I'm going to be talking to you about, rule of law, it's not just a very serious topic, it's also a topic that I think at Francisco Marroquin you hear about all the time. And that's unusual because the subject of rule of law is something that I can assure you is not studied particularly closely in, for example, North America and Western Europe. But it's very important because I think that rule of law in many respects marks the difference between a society that aspires to be civilized and societies that are not civilized. Because rule of law on the one hand is about many good things, but rule of men, which is the opposite of rule of law, is about arbitrary government. We also know, and this is another reason why rule of law is very important, is that rule of law has not been the norm for most of human history. Most societies have not experienced rule of law for long periods of time. And what's interesting about rule of law and economic development is that when we speak about economic development, we often talk about it in terms of reducing regulation, getting rid of unnecessary restrictions upon things like trade, competition, and the pursuit of self-interest. And that's true. But I think when we talk like that and we think like that, we forget just how much economic development relies upon the existence and the preservation of certain legal institutions and certain legal practices. So market economies, commercial societies, are not lawless societies. If you don't have legal protections for things like freedom of association, if you don't have procedural safeguards against things like arbitrary rule, then I can assure you that economic development, it might occur, but it's going to be far less productive and far less civilizing than it otherwise would be. So there's many reasons why we should be taking rule of law seriously. I can also tell you that people living in developed economies of Western Europe, North America, many people in developed countries take rule of law for granted. They assume, for example, that judges will just apply received law in a consistent way. They just assume that there are certain things the government will never do. And because these things are assumed, there's a sense that the law is working invisibly, almost unnoticed in many instances, to achieve these good ends. So there's many people in developed economies, I think, simply don't appreciate how important rule of law is, not just for economic development, but also for the development of civilized societies. So I want to do three things today. First of all, I'm going to define what's meant by rule of law. Second, I'm going to make some suggestions about what I think rule of law means for economic development. The third thing I'm going to talk about is rule of law and its implications for Latin America. So when we define rule of law, to start with rule of law, what we mean by rule of law, we hear people use this phrase rule of law all the time. But what's interesting is that they rarely give it concrete definition. They rarely define what rule of law actually means. So I'm going to give you a definition, some definitions of rule of law. First of all, rule of law is not democracy. We hear many people today, when they speak about rule of law, and you ask them, what do you mean by rule of law? They say, democracy. Well, It's certainly true that democratic systems can embody rule of law, but a society can also be very democratic in the sense that it obeys majority rule, but there's no necessary association between majority rule on the one hand and rule of law on the other. Because when you think about it, majority rule can be highly unjust. A majority of people can want the wrong thing, whether it's through plebiscites or through legislatures. Democratic majority rule can be highly unstable. In some forms, it can even assume a type of tyrannical character. We're not often used to hearing that, but democracies can be just as tyrannical as any other political system. So democracy and rule of law are not the same thing. Not the same thing. I think we get closer to what we mean by rule of law when we start to think about what's meant by rule and what's meant by law. So rule means something that's authoritative, something that's binding. Law is what I take law to mean what people like Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas meant when they described law as, quote, an ordinance of reason for the common good. More precisely, it means legal justice. Legal justice. Rule of law is fundamentally about legal justice. When we come to define rule of law, another preliminary thing we need to think about is the moral quality of rule of law. What's the moral quality of rule of law? Now, for some people, rule of law has no moral dimension whatsoever. It simply is what it is. That's often called legal positivism. A second position are those who regard rule of law as directly flowing from morality. I'm going to offer you a position of rule of law that was, I think, best captured by a Harvard legal philosopher writing in the mid-20th century. And his name was Lon, L-O-N, Fuller, F-U-L-L-E-R, Lon Fuller. So on the one hand, Fuller did not see rule of law as immediately derived from morality. But at the same time, he said there is a connection between rule of law and morality. He also argued that certain moral standards, what he called principles of legality, are part of the very concept of rule of law. What does this mean? What it means is that no element of law, whether it's civil law, common law, or legislation, is true law if it fails to meet these moral standards. So let me describe the 8 characteristics of rule of law. These are the 8 characteristics of rule of law. First, the rules must be sufficiently general and universally applicable. That's the first one. Second, the rules must be publicly promulgated. They have to be known. There's no such thing as secret law. Third, rules must be prospective. That means laws are applicable to future behavior, not so much past actions. Fourth, laws must be clear, intelligible, and understandable. If a law is completely incomprehensible, that means it's probably violating rule of law. If you can't understand the law, if no one can understand a law, then it probably is not meeting the standard of rule of law. Fifth, laws have to be free from contradictions. that doesn't just mean that a law has to be free of its own internal contradictions. It also means that laws cannot contradict other laws. Sixth, laws have to be relatively stable. You can't have laws being constantly changed all the time, otherwise it becomes impossible for us to understand which laws we should be obeying. Seventh, the law has to be possible for us to obey. What I mean by that is that the law can't command people to do things that are unreasonable. The law can't command you to torture other people. The law can't command you to murder other people. The law can't tell you to steal from other people. So laws cannot tell you to do things that are impossible. Eighth, this is the last characteristic. The laws have to be administered in a way that's consistent with their meaning. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that you can't have judges interpreting laws in ways that are contradictory to their meaning. Now, judges do this all the time. They're constantly contradicting what is the plain meaning of law. I mention that because I think we often forget, we fail to see just how often rule of law is routinely violated. If you think through those 8 criteria that I just mentioned, they're violated all the time. So rule of law is something that has this very concrete meaning, and we shouldn't underestimate just how often it's violated. So this isn't just a question of laws being helpful or laws being useful. It's also about rules being reasonable. Laws have to be reasonable. So in other words, it's unreasonable for laws to be constantly changed all the time. It's unreasonable to have laws that are impossible to obey. It's unreasonable for judges to put their own idiosyncratic interpretation upon laws. So in other words, rule of law and being reasonable are very much connected. Very, very much connected. To be unreasonable is to be unjust, and to be unjust is to be unreasonable. So when we think about that, I think we start to see why rule of law is very important if we want societies that are free, that value liberty, but also take justice seriously. Now you might be saying, okay, that makes sense, but what does this have to do with developing countries? What does this have to do with economic development? Well, I think it's important to note that the focus of rule of law, the purpose of rule of law, is not economic development. The primary focus of rule of law is justice and liberty. Now that said, I also think that rule of law is fundamental if you want to have long-term, stable economic growth and prosperity. When laws are clear, when laws are widely known, when laws apply equally to everyone, all individuals, whether they're entrepreneurs or whether they're consumers, they all benefit from equal treatment by the law. And this matters because trust in the legal system provides a strong environment for the development and growth of entrepreneurship and the business sector more generally. Now, I suspect this is not the first time someone at Francisco Marroquín has said this to you. I suspect this is not the first time. But maybe it's worth considering that it's only in very recent decades that more people have started to study the significance of rule of law for economic development more generally. So let's cast our minds back to the late 1980s and 1990s. I suspect most of you were not born then. I was. Tells you something about how old I am. But what was interesting about the 1980s and 1990s is that the emphasis of people who were working upon economic development was upon particular policy issues. Many of you have probably heard of what was called the Washington Consensus. How many people have heard of the Washington Consensus? Okay, some of you have. This was a set of principles that just happened to be devised in Washington, D.C. that was all about, these are the things that societies need to do if they want to remove certain distortions in their economies in order to restart economic growth and to control inflation after decades, in many cases, of outright socialism and in other cases, widespread corruption. But what's interesting about the Washington Consensus is that rule of law does not figure very prominently in its recommendations. So my point is this: it's only been relatively recently that economists, legal scholars, even philosophers have started asking questions about the significance of rule of law for economic development. So what does rule of law do for economic development? How does it help to generate stable economic growth and prosperity? Well, I think it does several things. 6 things, in fact. First of all, rule of law ensures what's called due process, basic demands of justice, and predictability. Those of you who are involved in business or are aspiring to be involved in business know that predictability in the legal system is fundamental for successful entrepreneurship. You need to know what the law is if you're operating in the world of business. And if the law is constantly changing, it gets harder and harder and harder to be a successful entrepreneur. Which brings me to my second point, that rule of law protects and promotes entrepreneurship because it establishes clear and objective rules for even little things about how you open a business or how you close a business. Thirdly, rule of law ensures stability. It creates certainty, and it establishes clear legal boundaries for something that's fundamental for economic development, and that is what we call property rights. If you don't have rule of law, you really don't have property rights. And if there's anything we learn from the study of economic history, it is that property rights are essential for economic development. No rule of law means no property rights. No property rights means very little economic development or dysfunctional economic development. Fourthly, rule of law forces public officials, government officials, judges, lawyers, it forces them to be accountable. It forces them to be accountable because it means they can't do whatever they want. And when you restrict the ability of governments or lawyers or judges to do whatever they want, you create more predictability. You also create a greater sphere of liberty. And another lesson of economic history is that you cannot sustain long-term economic growth without freedom. Fifthly, rule of law establishes a balance of power. It establishes a balance of power between the executive branch of government, the judicial branch of government, and the legislative branch of government. So to that extent, it defines what these branches of government can do and should do and what they may not do. It also means that they check each other. This is very important when it comes to limiting government power. Which brings me to the last point, that rule of law puts a check on the ability of governments to exercise power over individuals. Rule of law is much more important for protecting us from overmighty state officials than democracy. Much, much more important. And when people are guaranteed some protection from the state, particularly when it comes to their use of property rights, it enables them to exercise more liberty, more creativity, more entrepreneurship when it comes to living life in a dynamic market economy. So, when we think about rule of law from that perspective, we start to see that rule of law is very, very important for generating broad-based economic growth. It does things like ensures the orderly administration of justice. It puts limits on the capacity of governments to regulate the economy. Rule of law also means that you can enforce contracts. You can enforce the protection of property rights, including intellectual property rights. Above all, rule of law enhances the ability of everyone in this room to make informed economic choices, whether it's how I run my business or whether it's when I go and buy something from a merchant or from a business. Because rule of law reduces unpredictability. Rule of law means that I can safely assume that if I enter into a property dispute with someone, that there will be an objective judge who will rule in accordance with what the law says is the right thing to do, what is the just thing to do. It's also not surprising that when a society suffers from a lack of rule of law, what happens? What happens in the economy is that entrepreneurs, in a society that lacks rule of law, entrepreneurs and other people who create wealth will often choose to simply leave that society, to go to another society where there is stronger conditions for rule of law. Or they might decide, in light of the lack of rule of law, not to even bother being an entrepreneur or even starting a business in the first place. So without rule of law, you start to see very clearly that it reduces the capacity of an economy to grow. People who are entrepreneurs will either leave or they will turn into something else. They will become what I call political entrepreneurs. And political entrepreneurs are people whose focus is not consumers and what consumers want. Political entrepreneurs are people who are focused upon extracting things from the political system, who become very good at extracting privileges from the political system. I'm going to be talking about, later this week in different forums, I'm going to be talking about a problem which I suspect some of you are familiar with called cronyism. And I think that lack of rule of law turns entrepreneurs in many cases into what I call crony capitalists. So what are some of the other effects of rule of law in economic development? Well, as I said, rule of law limits the ability of the state to arbitrarily interfere with our lives. So what that means is it limits the ability of state officials to interfere with what we buy and sell. It also limits the ability of the state to interfere with prices. In other words, rule of law inhibits the ability of the state to try and engage in the type of extensive economic planning that undermines the functions of a market economy. The other thing it does which I think is very important to keep in mind, is that rule of law ensures equality before the law. It does not involve trying to produce an equality of result. It doesn't involve trying even to produce an equality of opportunity. So rule of law is about, in many respects, the equality of every single person before the law. And this matters because it limits the ability of the state to engage in social engineering, let alone promoting the type of collectivist policies that have such damaging effects upon economic growth. The other thing the rule of law does when it comes to economic growth is it reminds us of what the state should be doing in the economy. It reminds us that the state has a responsibility to uphold contracts, that the state has a responsibility to protect private property, that the state has a responsibility to maintain peace, to punish fraud, and to protect people's freedoms to buy, trade, and sell. And the state's ability to perform these functions in a coherent way is very, very dependent upon rule of law. So, for example, if we lived in a society where the state protected some people's property but not others, that punished some people's fraud but not others, this would be contributing to a disintegration of the rule of law. But they would also be contributing to undermining some of the very foundations of market economies. So rule of law doesn't just limit the state's ability to do certain things, it also reminds us of what the state should do in the conditions of a dynamic market economy. Now that's still all very general. It's still all very general. So let me take what I've said and say something about the ways in which rule of law applies to economic development in Latin America. Now, one of the things that I think we're learning from life in a global economy is that regions of the world, like Latin America, have to increasingly compete with, for example, Asian countries if they want to attract things like foreign investment. Now, we also know that, with the exception maybe of Brazil, countries in Latin America simply are not as big in terms of their economies when it comes to countries like, say, China or India. They're just bigger economies. So what does rule of law have to do with this? Well, my argument is that countries, such as countries in Latin America, if they can advance rule of law in the conditions in which they find themselves, they can gain a type of comparative advantage over economies like India and China. If Latin American economies, if Latin American governments prioritized the establishment of rule of law, it would give them a very important comparative advantage over China, which to my mind has no interest in establishing rule of law at all, or countries like India, which has struggled for a very long time to establish rule of law. In other words, Latin America has an economic self-interest in promoting rule of law because it would give Latin America a comparative advantage over some very big and at the moment still growing economies in other parts of the world. So let's consider how rule of law has advanced and how it has not advanced in Latin America over the past 25 years. Now, we've seen some good and positive developments in the advance of rule of law in much of Latin America. But it turns out that it's not so easy to alter what amounts to hundreds of years of particular legal cultures and particular institutional cultures. Now, reform efforts associated with rule of law began in Latin America very much in the late 1980s and in the 1990s. So, for example, by the early 1990s, we saw constitutionally limited governments established pretty much in every country in Latin America, with the notable and ongoing exception of Cuba. So constitutionally limited government has become more or less the norm in most of Latin America. That is a sign of the progress of rule of law, because you can't have rule of law without constitutionally limited government. So that's one good advance. Second, we have seen in much of Latin America considerable reforms of the judiciary. We've seen governments moving in the direction of providing better access to the justice system and limiting the capacity of government officials to engage in arbitrary behavior. That's included things like the modernization of penal codes, the transition from inquisitorial to accusatorial trials, and the construction of new judicial institutions, and the establishment of modern training for judges and judicial personnel. So those are all positive things, I think, that have happened in much of Latin America when it comes to rule of law. So what are some of the negatives? Where have we not seen advances? Where have we seen actual regression? Well, one major obstacle that remains to the furtherance of rule of law throughout Latin America is, frankly, the proliferation of regulation and regulatory agencies throughout much of Latin America. You've seen the proliferation in virtually every Latin American country of bureaucracies which have overlapping functions, in many cases which are tightly tied to political offices. And this haphazard process of growth in regulation has hurt businesses, it's hurt corporations, and ultimately it's hurt the ability of government to create rule of law. Why? Because it's helped to create complicated rules and procedures that people have to follow if they want to start a business, if they want to invest, if they want to manage a business. In other words, the growth of regulation and the growth of regulatory authorities, I think, has greatly inhibited the growth and spread of rule of law in many Latin American countries. So that tells us there's something to do. It tells us that simplifying regulation will do a great deal to advance the rule of law throughout much of Latin America. Moreover, a stable and easy to understand system of regulation will help to attract foreign investment, and that will bring economic growth. A very good example is El Salvador. That's a country which in the 2000s greatly reduced the amount of regulation and regulatory agencies, which not only made it easier for people to start businesses, it also attracted foreign capital. Because foreign capital will go to those countries where they see a stable system of rule of law. I would argue that maybe the biggest obstacle to China growing further as an economy is its more or less complete absence of rule of law. There's other things, I think, that ways in which rule of law can be advanced. One, I think, is the establishment of clear and easy to understand rules of contract. By that, I just don't mean people being able to enter relatively freely into agreements. What I mean is that if contracts are easier to understand, if the process of making contracts is simpler, if the enforcement of contracts is easier to undertake, then I think you'll see rule of law start to advance even further. Because there's nothing that I think is more corrosive of rule of law than a lack of confidence that if I enter into a contract with someone, it's unlikely that the judges will enforce the contract. Without rule of law, there's really no ability to maintain and protect a robust regime of contracts. And without a robust regime of contracts, you can't have economic development sustained for a long period of time. Another way in which I think you can advance rule of law is, ironically enough, through trade agreements. When you look at things like the North American Free Trade Agreement, or what used to be called NAFTA, to things like the Central American Free Trade Agreement, what's interesting about many of these agreements is that they have embodied some sort of commitment to rule of law by those countries which are signing these agreements. And that's interesting, I think, because it's an interesting case of how trade agreements, by emphasizing things like the importance of property rights, by emphasizing things like the importance of contracts, they have managed to filter down into many Latin American societies and thereby improve the quality of rule of law. So the more that countries enter into free trade agreements, the more likely it is that you'll see rule of law proliferate in many of these societies. Fourthly, another area in which rule of law needs much more dramatic improvement in Latin America is when it comes to something I've already spoken about, and that is the recognition and the enforcement of private property rights. Private property rights, as I'm sure I don't need to remind people at Francisco Marroquín, is one of the most fundamental individual rights, and yet it is also an area in which Latin America has struggled for a very long period of time. This is important because owning property and having the assurance that your property will not be arbitrarily violated by other people or by the government is essential if you're going to have more and more people participating in the economy. The value of a person's property, as you know, can be leveraged to secure credit, to secure loans, to secure capital. All these things that are necessary to make people active participants in a market economy. So in other words, property rights can be a very crucial step towards alleviating poverty and increasing economic growth throughout Latin America. But you cannot have strong property rights without rule of law. That's not just in terms of land, it's also in terms of things like intellectual property rights. It's also in terms of giving people incentives to create wealth in the first place. Because if there's anything that will discourage people from creating wealth, it's the sense that if I create the wealth, it could be arbitrarily taken away from me, either by other people or by the government. Rule of law prevents that from happening. Now, there's many more things I could say about rule of law, but let me conclude on this particular note. If we take rule of law seriously, and remember I mentioned, I don't think most people do take it seriously, but if rule of law is taken seriously, it has the potential to have profound transformative effects upon not just the economies, but also the politics and the legal systems of developing economies. So in the end, I think rule of law has much more potential to enhance economic growth and also create more justice and a greater sphere for liberty. It has much more potential in this regard than things like reducing government spending. That's important, but rule of law is fundamentally much more important for economic development than any number of economic policies. So the more countries move in the direction of rule of law, the more prosperous they will become. But let me end on a sober note. And I don't want you to interpret this as pessimism. I want you to think about this in terms of being realists, what I'll call realism. As I've mentioned, in parts of Latin America, we have seen some positive developments when it comes to rule of law. But we've also seen regression. We've seen backward steps. We've seen rule of law be severely damaged in those countries that have gone down the path of populism. countries like Bolivia, countries like Ecuador, countries like Nicaragua, and of course, the shining example of Venezuela. These are countries in which rule of law has been identified as an obstacle to economic equality, where rule of law has been dismissed as the creation of a middle class to protect its own interests, where rule of law has been reduced to whatever the government wants at a particular point in time. So there's been some very wide-scale failures of rule of law in much of Latin America, which is directly attributable to the growth of populist governments in parts of Latin America. But leaving aside those particular problems, I think there's a wider issue. We've seen sporadic change which is good, but we've also seen regression. So how do we get beyond this? Do we just have to settle for incremental change, for making one step forward and then 5 steps back? Because it seems that many people in Latin America are just content to accept little success in the midst of widespread decline. Now, I don't have a silver bullet to offer you tonight when it comes to expanding and growing rule of law in Latin America. But what I can say is this. Part of the issue is that policy and legislation is not enough when it comes to ensuring the growth and the protection of rule of law. You can pass as many laws as you like, trying to install those 8 principles of rule of law that I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks. You can pass as many pieces of legislation as you want, but there's no guarantee that rule of law is going to take root. Because in the end, I think, rule of law is fundamentally a question of ideas, of beliefs, of expectations, and attitudes. Rule of law is also a question of people, not just societies and governments, but also individuals making concrete choices. Of people deciding, for example, that arbitrary behavior on the part of government should never be tolerated. It's also a question of people understanding and appreciating the nature of legal justice. It's people also understanding that rule of law is not just about mutual protection, it's also about the common good, both here, but also in the future and the years to come. Now, it's true that economies can thrive up to a certain point without rule of law. China is a good example. There's no rule of law in China, but the economy seems to be growing. But here's the thing. I have grave doubts about the ability of the Chinese economy or the economy of India to continue to grow without some sort of commitment to rule of law. So while changes in the law matter, while changes in the political system matter, and while, of course, incentives certainly matter, rule of law really depends. And I say this to you because you're young, much younger than I am. Rule of law really depends on a change of mind, of behavior, and those changes of mind and behavior are crucial for your free choices and your free actions. And the thing about all that is that changing the way we think about the world, changing our beliefs, changing our expectations is very, very hard. Even in prosperous societies, it's very, very hard to do this. But that's why I think in the end, that's where the changes have to happen if we want to see rule of law progress. Legislation matters, policy matters, but unless there is a change of mind and heart and culture on the part of people living in developing economies, rule of law will not flourish. On the positive side, if people are willing to make the changes in the way that they view the world, the way they understand the legal system, what they understand rule of law to be, the prospects for economic growth and the spread of liberty, not just economic liberty, but political liberty as well, I think are beyond our imagination. Thank you.